Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Thursday, April 23rd, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. In Riverside today, the temperature will reach a high of 76.7 degrees while dropping to a low of 51.3 degrees. It looks to be a mild and pleasant day for the area. On today's show, we are examining the complex maritime standoff between the United States and Iran to understand how it escalated into a worldwide energy crisis. We will also dive into the recent legal developments surrounding California's attempt to require identification for federal immigration agents, and why those efforts have been blocked. Additionally, we have a handful of other important stories to discuss as we round out the news. All of this and more is coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We begin this morning with a crisis that's sending shockwaves through global energy markets and diplomacy alike. Yesterday, Iranian forces seized multiple commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz, deepening an already dire standoff with the United States. Ethan has been tracking every development. Ethan, walk us through what happened yesterday.
Grace, what we saw yesterday was a dramatic escalation. The Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, fired on and seized 3 outbound merchant vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. PBS NewsHour, NPR News, and the Associated Press all confirm these attacks targeted ships trying to transit a waterway that handles 20% of the world's oil and 25% of its liquefied natural gas. This is now arguably the most dangerous choke point on the planet, and yesterday's actions have brought U.S.-Iran relations to an absolute breaking point.
3 ships seized in a single day. Do we know which vessels were targeted?
We do, and the details are striking. The first was the Epaminondas, a Liberia-flagged container ship managed by Technomar. The Times-Union reports that an IRGC gunboat fired on it off the coast of Oman, causing heavy damage to the vessel's bridge before troops boarded and escorted it toward the Iranian coast. The second was the MSC Francesca, a Panama-flagged container vessel seized alongside the Epaminondas. Both of those ships are currently being held near Syriac, Iran. The third vessel is where things get a bit murky. NPR News identified it as the Baghdad, a Jordanian-flagged cargo ship, while Iranian state media referred to a vessel called the Euphoria. What we know is that ship was attacked and became stranded on the Iranian coast.
What about the crews on board? Are they safe?
As of this morning, maritime authorities and the UK Maritime Trade Operations, known as UKMTO, report that the crews of the Epaminondas and the MSC Francesca are safe and accounted for. However, they remain in Iranian custody. The IRGC says it's conducting what it calls inspections of cargo and navigation systems. So while the crews are alive, they are certainly not free to leave.
Iran is calling this a response to something the U.S. did first. What's the backstory there?
That's a critical piece of context. The Iranian government has characterized yesterday's seizures as a, quote, crushing response, end quote, to what they call American maritime piracy. According to the Washington Post and CBS News, the specific provocation Iran cites is the U.S. Navy's seizure of the Iranian tanker Tuska on April 19th, just 4 days ago. That incident involved the guided missile destroyer USS Spruance intercepting the Tuska in the Gulf of Oman. When the tanker refused to submit to inspection, the Spruance used its 5-inch Mark 45 gun to conduct what the Navy described as disabling fire into the engine room. U.S. Marines then rappelled onto the deck and secured the vessel.
And the justification for seizing it?
The Trump administration alleged that Tuska was carrying dual-use electronics and metal components intended for ballistic missile manufacturing, but The Guardian and Lloyd's List both note that no independent international inspectors have verified that claim yet. So there's a real question about whether this seizure was justified, and Iran is using that ambiguity to frame its own actions as proportional retaliation.
This all ties back to a larger operation, right? Operation Economic Fury?
Exactly. The Tuska seizure was part of Operation Economic Fury, a maximalist U.S. naval blockade launched on April 13th. This is not a limited action. Legal experts interviewed by the Washington Times point out that under international law and the San Remo Manual, A blockade like this is technically an act of war, a casus belli. That's an enormous legal and diplomatic threshold to cross. Iran argues the blockade is a flagrant violation of the 14-day ceasefire that Pakistan mediated, which began on April 8th. So from Tehran's perspective, Washington broke the truce first.
Let's talk about the economic fallout. What are we seeing in the energy markets this morning?
It is severe, Grace. PBS NewsHour reports that Brent crude oil prices have spiked to nearly $100 a barrel. That's a 35% increase since this broader war began on February 28th. Some analysts are warning prices could exceed $120 if this stalemate drags on. We're hearing people describe this as possibly the largest disruption to the world oil market in history, and when you look at the numbers, it's hard to argue with that.
How much shipping has actually been disrupted?
The scale is staggering. Approximately 2,000 commercial ships and 20,000 seafarers are currently trapped in the Persian Gulf, unable to exit because of the IRGC's closure of the strait combined with the U.S. blockade. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has plummeted by 80%, dropping from 20 million barrels per day to roughly 3.8 million. And the European Union's Energy Commissioner has stated the disruption is costing Europe approximately $600 million per day. That's an almost incomprehensible drain on the global economy, day after day.
With all this at stake, where do diplomatic efforts stand right now?
In a word, stalled. High-level negotiations have been taking place in Islamabad, Pakistan, but they've hit a wall. ABC News and NPR report that President Trump indefinitely extended a ceasefire on April 21st at Pakistan's request, which was a positive gesture. But he has refused to lift the naval blockade. Iran responded by refusing to send a delegation to any further talks until that blockade is dismantled. So you have both sides digging in on their preconditions. And the diplomats are stuck in what one official described as fragile pragmatism. That phrase might be generous at this point.
There's also a major summit on the horizon with China. How does Beijing factor into all of this?
This might be the most consequential piece of the puzzle. President Trump is scheduled to visit Beijing on May 14th through 15th, and that summit is being viewed as a make-or-break moment for global stability. Here's why China matters so much. Iran provides 8% of China's energy needs. The U.S. blockade under Operation Economic Fury specifically targets what's known as China's shadow fleet, tankers used to bypass sanctions on Iranian oil. So when Washington squeezes Iran, it's also squeezing Beijing.
And Washington is applying direct financial pressure on China as well?
Absolutely. The U.S. Treasury has issued formal warnings to two major Chinese banks, threatening to sever their access to the global dollar clearing system if they continue processing Iranian oil payments. That would be a devastating blow to those institutions. Analysts believe the Trump administration is essentially using the blockade as a carrot and stick, trying to secure Chinese cooperation in pressuring Tehran. The offer on the table may include tariff relief in exchange for China's help brokering a permanent Iranian nuclear deal. So the May summit in Beijing is really where the future of this crisis could be decided.
Ethan, we should step back and acknowledge the human cost of all of this. What are the latest casualty figures?
They're sobering, Grace. This maritime standoff is the latest chapter in a conflict that began with U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on February 28th. Since then, authorities report at least 3,375 deaths in Iran and 2,290 in Lebanon. In Israel, 23 people have been killed. The United States has lost 13 service members in the region. Those numbers have been climbing steadily, and with the strait effectively closed, there's no sign the pressure is easing on any side.
What should we be watching for in the coming days?
A couple of things. The International Maritime Organization has issued an emergency appeal for the release of the seized crews, so any movement there would be significant. Global markets will be watching closely for any signal from Washington or Tehran on the blockade. And ultimately, the May 14th summit in Beijing looms as the next real opportunity for a diplomatic breakthrough. Without one, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz threatens to drive global food and energy costs to truly unprecedented levels. This is a crisis that touches every corner of the world economy.
An enormously consequential story. Ethan, thank you for walking us through all of that.
Of course, Grace.
We turn now to a major ruling out of California that's shaking up the fight between state and federal authority over immigration enforcement. Chloe, what happened yesterday?
Yesterday, April 22nd, a three-judge panel on the Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals unanimously blocked a California law that required federal immigration agents to wear visible identification while on duty. The case is United States versus California, case number 26-926. CalMatters and SFGATE both report the 3-0 decision is a significant victory for the Trump administration and a real blow to California's sanctuary state framework.
So what exactly did this California law require agents to do?
The law in question is Section 10 of the No Vigilantes Act, which was Senate Bill 805, codified as California Penal Code Section 13654. It required non-uniformed federal officers, specifically those from Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection, to visibly display their names or badge numbers along with their agency's name while working in the state. Essentially, California was saying if you're going to operate here, the public needs to know who you are.
And the court said California can't do that?
That's right. Judge Mark J. Bennett, who's a Trump appointee, wrote the opinion and said the law violates the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution. He found that states are constitutionally barred from regulating the operations of the federal government. His specific language was that the act, quote, attempts to directly regulate the United States in its performance of governmental functions, end quote. It's a pretty sweeping statement about the limits of state power.
Were the other judges on board with that reasoning?
Completely. The panel also included Judge Daniel P. Collins, another Trump appointee, and Judge Jacqueline H. Nguyen, who's an Obama appointee. All three relied heavily on the 1890 Supreme Court precedent in Re-Neagle, which is at 135 U.S. 1. That foundational case established that federal officers are immune from state prosecution for actions taken within the scope of their duties. The Ninth Circuit used it to conclude that a state simply cannot dictate the how and when of federal law enforcement operations, even if the state frames it as a public safety measure.
Let's back up a bit. Why did California pass this law in the first place?
It goes back to June 2025. According to Northern California Public Media and KTVU, there were roving immigration sweeps in Southern California that really alarmed the public. Federal agents were wearing tactical masks, driving unmarked vehicles, and had no visible identification whatsoever. Governor Gavin Newsom signed the No Vigilantes Act in late 2025 in direct response to those operations. People were genuinely afraid of what looked like secret police tactics.
And California's Attorney General had a specific argument for why the IDs were needed, right?
He did. Attorney General Rob Bonta pointed to an October 2025 FBI intelligence bulletin that warned about a rise in ICE impersonators. The FBI found that criminals were exploiting the anonymity of legitimate federal tactics, things like masks and lack of ID, to commit robberies, kidnappings, and assaults in vulnerable immigrant communities. Bonta argued California had a duty to help the public tell the difference between real law enforcement and vigilante criminals. It was actually a pretty compelling public safety argument.
That's interesting because the FBI is also a federal agency. Wasn't there some tension there?
There was a real internal contradiction within the federal government, and the New Republic and Wired both highlighted it. The Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security fought the California law in court. But that same FBI report from 2025 actually recommended that federal agents, quote, adequately identify themselves during operations, end quote, to help the public verify their authority. So one arm of the federal government was saying agents should identify themselves, while two other arms were in court arguing the opposite.
So what's the federal government's argument for keeping agents anonymous?
DHS and ICE have maintained that anonymity is essential for agent safety. They argue that forcing agents to display names and badge numbers makes them targets for doxing, harassment, and retaliatory violence from anti-deportation activists. Acting U.S. Attorney General Todd Blanche praised the ruling on social media, calling it a, quote, big win, end quote, for agents who, quote, put their lives on the line, end quote. He also affirmed the DOJ's, quote, unwavering and total support, end quote, for ICE operations.
Now, this isn't the first time a judge has blocked part of this law, is it?
No, it's actually the second major blow to the No Vigilantes Act. Back in February 2026, U.S. District Judge Christina A. Snyder issued an injunction against a different portion of the law, the part that banned federal agents from wearing masks or face coverings. Judge Snyder found that the mask ban was discriminatory because it specifically targeted federal officers while exempting state police. That's an important distinction.
But Judge Snyder had actually allowed the ID requirement to stay in place, hadn't she?
She had. Judge Snyder compared it to speed limits that federal agents must follow, essentially arguing it was a generally applicable rule. But the Ninth Circuit's ruling yesterday overturned that logic entirely. The appeals court said identification mandates target sovereign functions rather than generally applicable conduct. So they drew a much sharper line between what states can and cannot require of federal agents.
How is California responding to these losses in court?
California lawmakers are doubling down hard. As of this morning, Cal Matters and Digital Democracy are tracking several aggressive bills moving through the state legislature. The first is SB 747, called the No Kings Act, introduced by Senators Scott Wiener and Aisha Wahab. It would create a state law cause of action, allowing Californians to sue federal officers in state court for civil rights violations, essentially designed to bypass federal qualified immunity. That bill remains under consideration in the Assembly Judiciary Committee as of today.
Are there other bills targeting federal agents specifically?
Several. SB 938 would impose a 10-year cooling-off period, disqualifying anyone who worked for ICE or CBP after January 20, 2025, from being hired as a peace officer in California. Then there's AB 1627, called the Melt ICE Act, which would permanently ban individuals employed by ICE between 2025 and 2029 from serving as police officers or public school teachers in the state. The scope on that one is really broad.
There's one more bill too, right?
Yes, AB 1896, called the GTFO Act, sponsored by Assemblyman Mark Gonzalez. It similarly disqualifies former federal immigration agents from a wide range of public employment in California. The message from California's leadership is clear. If they can't mandate federal identification, they'll use their employer's prerogative to control who enters state service and their police powers to facilitate litigation against federal misconduct.
Does this ruling affect other states beyond California?
It has huge implications across the entire West. Because the Ninth Circuit covers much of the western United States, similar laws recently passed in Oregon, that's HB 4138, and Washington, SB 5855, are now considered legally dead on arrival. Both of those laws also sought to unmask federal agents and mandate identification. They're effectively blocked before they even get challenged.
What about states outside the Ninth Circuit?
The ruling serves as powerful persuasive authority for federal challenges against similar unmasking laws in New Jersey, that's S-3114, and Illinois HB 1312. Legal experts suggest the DOJ will almost certainly use this precedent to argue that any state attempt to dictate the conduct or appearance of federal agents violates the Supremacy Clause. It could become a template for knocking down these laws nationwide.
Has California said whether they'll appeal?
As of this morning, Attorney General Rob Bonta's office stated they are reviewing the order and evaluating further legal strategy. But no formal appeal has been filed yet. For now, the ruling means federal agents can continue operating in California without the visible identification requirements the state tried to impose. Given how aggressive the legislature is being with those new bills, though, this fight is clearly far from over.
It really does seem like this battle between Sacramento and Washington is only intensifying. Chloe, thanks for walking us through all of that.
Happy to do it, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Warner Brothers Discovery shareholders have officially approved a blockbuster merger with Paramount Skydance that is certainly scripting a new chapter for Hollywood. The $110.9 billion deal was greenlit during a special meeting today, valuing the company at $31 per share. That is a 147% premium over its previous price, a figure that is truly paramount to the investors' interests. This all-cash agreement effectively cancels out a rival bid from Netflix, consolidating massive media libraries like HBO, CNN, CBS, and Paramount Pictures. Chief Executive Officer David Ellison noted the merger is a play for survival in the streaming era, promising to produce at least 30 theatrical films annually while merging HBO Max and Paramount Plus. However, the deal still has to clear some high hurdles at the Department of Justice. Senator Cory Booker is already raising red flags regarding this massive media consolidation and the use of foreign sovereign wealth funds. If this production doesn't reach its final cut by the third quarter of 2026, a ticking fee of 25 cents per share each quarter will begin to add up. In energy news, a crude standoff in Eastern Europe has finally reached a slick resolution. Russian oil flow through the southern leg of the Druzhba pipeline resumed at 2 a.m. on April 23, 2026, after a 3-month disruption. Slovak Economy Minister Denisa Sakova confirmed the breakthrough, which effectively fuels the end of a diplomatic stalemate. This development prompted Hungary and Slovakia to lift their vetoes on a massive €90 billion, or $106 billion aid package for Ukraine. These interest-free loans for 2026 and 2027 are essential for keeping Ukraine's state functions from running on empty. While President Zelensky called the resumption a right signal, Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico maintained that energy supplies were being used as geopolitical tools. This breakthrough also clears the way for the European Union to move forward with its 20th package of sanctions against Russia. Maryland is making sure grocery shoppers do not get a raw deal by becoming the first state to ban surveillance pricing. The General Assembly passed House Bill 895, which prohibits food retailers from using automated AI systems to set individualized prices based on your personal data or location. The state is also checking out surge pricing by mandating that grocery costs remain fixed for at least one business day. Governor Wes Moore says the law bags a victory for families against invasive data practices. While the Retailers Association initially put up a fight, they eventually checked out their opposition after securing exemptions for loyalty programs. The new rules take effect October 1, 2026, and violators will face a $10,000 fine for a first offense, a heavy price for predatory practices. A federal judge in Massachusetts has decided to blow the whistle on policies stalling renewable energy. Chief Judge Denise J. Casper issued an injunction striking down mandates that required the Interior Secretary to personally approve all solar and wind projects on federal lands. The court found these policies to be arbitrary and capricious, acting as a regulatory bottleneck for the industry. This bright ruling unfreezes a 57-gigawatt pipeline of clean energy, representing nearly $1 billion in committed capital that was previously stuck in the dark. Trade groups are celebrating the current situation, as construction can now resume on several land-based and offshore projects that were at risk of being canceled before 2029. Finally, a new study suggests that the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is truly answering the call. Research published in the Journal of the American Medical Association shows an 11% reduction in suicide deaths among Americans aged 15 to 34. That equates to 4,372 fewer deaths than projected between July 2022 and December 2024. In the 10 states with the highest call volumes, the mortality rate dropped by 18.2%. While the $1.5 billion federal investment has been a lifesaver, advocates warn that recent funding cuts and the termination of specialized services for LGBTQ youth could hang up this vital progress. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.